be screwed. Feel my own adrenaline, yeah, I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the 61st part of What If Harry Potter Meets My Little Pony? Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of tkepner on fanfictionnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. Of course, Princess Sparkle called out Albus to Twilight's head in his office floor. Just give me a moment to set the floor to receive you. Seconds later, the purple-haired princess popped out into the room. She looked at the two people already in the office and nodded. Have you had an opportunity to look at a pensive memory? She asked, going straight to business. They nodded. She nodded back. Good. I took a memory from Harry and I've been studying it carefully. She crossed her arms on her chest and started pacing. From the memory, it's obvious that Goyle suspected something from the beginning. She stopped and looked at them. I don't know if you know it, but apparently there's some sort of rivalry between Harry and Malfoy, Goyle, and Crabbe. Minerva Mood and Albus nodded. She resumed pacing. In addition, Mr. Rippy, you remember her from last year's incident, right? She was the only one to notice something was wrong. She stared at the headmaster. She had a warning for Harry just after Easter holidays. Yes, he certainly did remember the quiet Hufflepuff. Albus tilted his head slightly and raised an eyebrow to encourage her to continue. She resumed pacing. She said that she had noticed Goyle acting out of character since before Christmas. So, she started watching him more closely. Her tentative conclusion was that something about the situation reminded her of Quirinus Quirrell from last year. Nothing definite that she could take to a professor, but something, even so. She waved her right arm. Looking at the memory, it's easy to see that Goyle was suspicious of Lockhart's class. His expressions were quite out of line with those of Draco and Vincent. She shook her head. Clearly, Lockhart suspected something was up with Goyle. He was using this special class to isolate the boy from his class. Confronting him in a classroom would have been difficult and the boy might have grabbed a hostage. She huffed. By getting him on stage with only a few others nearby, he was better isolated. Plus, without a doubt, he planned to milk the situation for all the publicity it was worth, after the fact. After a brief pause, she continued. Anyway, he used his demonstrations to verify the situation by casting spells that would have been dead giveaways of his misgivings in a small classroom. She shook her head, again. It might have worked if Goyle hadn't been suspicious, already. Which was entirely out of character for the boy, according to Harry. Goyle and Crabbe were always slow to understand anything, Harry said. Thankfully, Lockhart managed to separate Harry, Hermione, and Susan from the rest before casting his last detection spell. That his wand vibrated slightly, you can tell if you look very closely in the memory. That, and he has a tiny smile afterward. That meant that whomever was possessed, and it was definitely a possession at that point, had to be one of Wayne, Sue, Stephen, Pansy, or Gregory. Wayne, Sue, and Stephen were out, because they hadn't aroused his suspicions. The same for Pansy. Which left Goyle. She stopped pacing and stared at them. You can see that when Lockhart starts to raise his wand to cast the stunning charm, Gregory's eyes widen and he, too, starts to raise his wand. Which he has had up his robe's sleeve the entire time since he had left his desk. Interestingly, the tip is already glowing, which means he had a spell ready to cast before Gilderoy even started. She sighed. The rest was quick. Goyle had already moved to the side before Lockhart cast his stunning charm. You can tell Lockhart saw Goyle's flipendo jinx just before it hit him. As Lockhart flew across the platform to hit MDM Bones, and Professors Flitwick and McGonagall, Goyle sent a second spell, a curse, at Harry. Harry, with Ellie's warning ahead of time, had a shield spell up already. She gave a proud smile, then continued, by then, Goyle had smoke billowing from his wand, obscuring everyone's view of him, and he used that cover to vacate the Great Hall using the Professor's door on that side. She paused a moment. The castle map shows he was out of the castle long before the auras showed. She grimaced. So, my conclusions are that, first, there weren't any vampires close enough for a possession. They would easily have been detected by the map weeks ago. She glanced at the map that took up most of a wall in the office. Second, we suspected there was a Horcrux in the castle hiding as a diary, but we couldn't find it. If the Horcrux is as powerful as the books claim, then it could have possessed Goyle. Given how close-mouthed the Slytherin wizards and witches are, it wouldn't surprise me if no one said anything about minor changes in Goyle's character from last year. Third, the spells used by Goyle are within reason for him to know, but not at the level of competence he demonstrated given his academic performance so far in Hogwarts, according to Harry. Also, to do what he did required far more control over his magical power than he has ever shown. She glanced between the two others. The only reasonable conclusion I can reach is that Goyle, indeed, has been possessed by the diary Horcrux. That being the case, we need to get to Lockhart as soon as possible. There is a spell I know called Trauma Location. It is a spell that, when cast on someone who has recently been the victim of some form of attack, will allow us to locate and view the person or persons who committed the act. She turned and looked at the map, obviously concentrating on Gilderoy's present location. He's still in the hospital wing, she said, surprised, looking back at them. Nodding firmly, Albus said, then let us be off. On the way, McGonagall explained that Lockhart had been knocked out when he crashed into them. MDM Pomfrey, not wanting to deal with his drama, had simply fixed him up with a potion, made him comfortable, and cast a spell to let him sleep and leave her in peace. But not before McGonagall and Director Bones got a statement from him about what he had planned. Soon enough they were grouped around his bed, the curtains drawn for privacy. He doesn't need to be awake for this spell, Twilight said as she drew her wand. Thank Merlin for small favors, Albus heard Minerva whisper. There were no fancy wand movements, she just pointed her wand at the sleeping professor. A magenta glow began to surround the wand, then a second later a beam of the same magenta encompassed the professor on the bed, growing to a globe in shape. One spot on the globe began to glow bright while a spot on the direct opposite side got darker. He's in that direction, she muttered, indicating the line formed by the two spots. Albus noted the direction indicated, and had a quick spell map of everything in that direction appear. Most notably, it included London, he saw. A scene started to form in the globe of some sort of room out of the mostly magenta fog. They could see a bed, wardrobe, desk, a window, and what might have been a television in one corner begin to form. But then they slowly dissipated back into the fog, and the two spots on the globe faded away. Twilight sighed, and the magenta magic faded. Well, she said, dejected, either he is too far for more information, or he just died. Too far? Albus asked, staring at his map as the coast of France appeared beyond London on his image map. Dead, gasped Minerva. The princess shrugged. That could have been the cabin of a fairy. She frowned. I haven't really determined the exact limit of that spell. Her mood noticeably brightened. A new research project. A notebook floated up beside her, with a pencil. She hummed to herself as she made notes and rearranged a few things in her scheduler. And yes, one of the reasons for the spell to fail is that the target died in the meantime, she distractedly said. However, he was alive when I cast the spell or we wouldn't have gotten a direction indication, so I rather doubt he just up and died for no reason. Plus, if he's traveling, then the Horcrux diary wouldn't dare to try to assimilate him, so probably not. It is more likely he's on a ferry and it just exceeded the spell's range. Or maybe he was somewhere with a flow and just stepped into it to a point that was outside the spell's range. She looked around the room absent-mindedly. Unfortunately, he has probably mastered your apparition. Tom was 17, a sixth year, when he made the diary. Hopefully, he's not very proficient at it yet, and can only travel to places Goyle's visited. Fortunately, almost everywhere else he might go to has changed, and it would be very dangerous to attempt. She shook her head. If he did, he might find himself inside a wall. She turned to him. I can leave you to tell all this to MDM Bones, right? She shivered slightly. I have some research I need to conduct, she said brightly, appearing far too happy at the prospect. He nodded slowly. I think MDM Bones would be most interested in your trauma location spell. I find myself intrigued by it. She frowned, and sighed. Okay. The spell was surprisingly difficult to MSTR using her methods, which were far more mathematical and formula-based than the methods wizards used. It took him, and Minerva, a significant amount of time to learn the spell. But once mastered, it was easy to cast. This spell would be quite the time saver in catching any students who might cast harmful spells at others. The miscreants' own magic would betray them. There now, she said, pleased, you can teach MDM Bones the spell, right? She handed him the formula she had written down on parchment. Tom left the hotel TV running in the background as he executed his scheme for Goyle's lifeless body. It had gone much quicker than he had expected. Draining the boy's magic so deeply had been a tremendous help. The boy finally stopped breathing not too much after the news program ended. He made sure to place the body as if it had been callously discarded at the side of the bed. He made sure to cast a few drops of duplicated BLD around the wound and on the floor. He spent the rest of the afternoon, evening, and until late at night, perusing the channels. This world of the Muggles was fascinating in a way that 1945 had never been. Maybe they weren't as useless as he had thought. Surprising him, Harry's mum dropped by a second time. She gave him a huge hug. I can't stay for long, dear, I have some research to conduct. She shivered and her eyes had a bright, happy quality to them. He pursed his lips and smiled. Research. The only thing that truly made his mum happy besides him, Spike, and her friends. She hurried back out. Then the girls insisted they all take showers. Which made sense. They were still coated with dust from the morning, after all. Drying off afterwards, Harry had to admit that the shower had been a good idea. He felt much better after watching the grime and dirt spiral into the drain in the floor. He met with the others back in the common room, only to be told by the prefects, a few minutes later, that dinner would be in half-hour, and that attendance was mandatory. Entering the Great Hall was a surreal experience. Remembering the destruction they had last seen, and now seeing the hall as if it had never happened, almost made Harry question if he had dreamt the whole thing. Only his friends being equally amazed showed he hadn't imagined it. The Aurors had been right. The hall looked cleaner and brighter than he ever had seen it. He hadn't realized that the dark tone to the floor was from centuries of wear from people walking on it. The walls had apparently slowly accumulated dirt and grime over the centuries despite the house elves' efforts. They practically gleamed under the torches lining them. Even the tables and benches looked and felt new, with shaper edges and clearer grain. Not seeing the late afternoon sky overhead was disappointing. Whatever enchantments that had been on the ceiling had been destroyed by the damage done by the bombardos. Somewhat reassuring, though, all the professors, including Lockhart, were in evidence. Dumbledore was nodding and smiling. Lockhart looked pale and withdrawn. As soon as the last few students came in and were seated, Dumbledore stood. I have a few words, he said in his old, kindly voice. Harry immediately felt his back hairs go up. First, let me reassure you all that there were no permanent injuries suffered by anyone in this morning's regrettable incident. In fact, he looked around the room with a gentle smile, I can confidently say that everyone who was injured has made a full recovery. MDM Pomfrey's skills were on full display, and I thank her for her dedication and attention to detail in preventing any lapses. He turned slightly and bowed to the hospital wing matron. When straightened, he clapped his hands lightly, several times, creating by example a tremendous applause from the students. We also owe a thanks to Princess Sparkle for healing all the remaining injuries so promptly when she arrived from doing the same at St. Mungo's. He led another round of applause. Sadly, he continued, we are missing 3 students. Mr. Malfoy and Mr. Crabbe are currently at St. Mungo's undergoing evaluation. It seems that they were under a compulsion this morning, and were not in control of themselves. Mr. Goyle is missing, and has apparently fled Hogwarts and Hogsmeade. He paused a moment and peered over his glasses at the students. Unfortunately, he has not gone home. His parents are extremely worried for him, as am I. If any of you have a suggestion as to where he might have gone, please confide in your head of house, or a prefect. We shall not disclose the identity of anyone who does so. He paused and gave the students another long glance. There has been speculation that a vampire was controlling the boy. However, I can unequivocally say that there hasn't been a vampire on Hogwarts grounds in the last 10 years. It isn't impossible that he was under the thrall of a vampire, but the creature was not close enough to exert any control over him. Why he acted the way he did is a mystery. He shook his head sadly. We think he might have been compulsed. Which is another reason why we would like to find and talk with him. He sighed, obviously unhappy at the next part of his announcements. Please ignore the Aurors you will be seeing at Hogwarts over the next few days. Do not bother them. If they stop you and ask any questions, answer as completely as you can. He paused again, and smiled. On a lighter note, the Hufflepuff-Gryffindor Quidditch game has been rescheduled for next Saturday. This announcement was met with more than a few cheers from both the Hufflepuff and Gryffindor tables, most notably, from the team players and their most ardent fans. He stopped and raised both arms, outstretched as if to give a benediction. And that concludes my announcements for this evening. Enjoy your repast. Food immediately appeared on the tables, and everyone dug in. Major Castor Searle and Princess Twilight were already seated when Prime Minister John Major, My.5 Director General Sir Patrick Jeremy Walker, and the head of the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, Sir Colin McCall came into the conference room. All had sour expressions. They were accompanied by their respective assistants. Their expressions weren't a surprise, given the suddenness of the call and the fact that it was late on a Saturday. Not wasting time, Major started with, well, what happened this time, immediately after greeting the other 3. It was said in an offhand manner. One would almost think he was joking except for the hard lines around his eyes. Princess Twilight blushed, and cleared her throat. Nothing regarding the portal, fortunately, she said briskly, and with a bit of relief. This time the problem is on the wizards and witches' side. Both directors raised their eyebrows. I'm telling you because the Minister of Magic doesn't believe this is a serious problem. Having dealt with the individual, Tom Riddle, before, I know he isn't to be taken lightly, she said. I'll make this brief. She slid 2 thick folders across the table to them. I don't want to make you any later for dinner than you already will be. She huffed. None of you were in charge, so you may not know this. In the very late 1970s and first 2 years of the 1980s, the wizarding world had to deal with a homegrown terrorist who called himself Voldemort. He liked attacking non-magicals, new magicals, those who were half-bloods, and anyone who disagreed with him. He was rather indiscriminate in his methods. He sought to overthrow the ministry and install himself as king. She shook her head. Most of his and his followers' misdeeds were attributed to gas explosions, Irish terrorists, or flaws in construction to hide the truth from the non-magicals. She nodded at the folders. Those are a summary of the times, and the crimes of his and his followers. You will find that many of the incidents attributed to him that affected the non-magical society were blamed on the Irish or gas explosions. She paused to let that settle. Supposedly, in October of 1981, he was killed. We discovered last year he had somehow survived, and he made a brief reappearance. We apprehended him. The details are in the folders and thought the matter settled. She sighed forlornly. We were wrong. Yesterday, we discovered he had somehow split himself decades ago and stored part of himself in an artifact. All six gave her incredulous looks. Yes, she said, nodding, I know it sounds impossible by your standards, but it is magically possible to do this. It's extremely painful and tends to drive the person insane, I gather. She gave them another moment to think, then continued. He has apparently been using one of the students in Hogwarts as a stooge for the last 7 or 8 months. Yesterday, he came out into the open, caused a great deal of damage to the Great Hall at Hogwarts when it was full of students, and escaped in the confusion. Again, details are in the folders. I was, naturally, in Equestria. Headmaster Dumbledore, unfortunately, had traveled to London for an unrelated matter. Here's the problem. Tom Riddle, Jr. His real name is a half-BLD, and well acquainted with the non-magical society. He won't make the mistakes that most other wizards and witches are prone to do when among non-magicals. He will be able to blend in almost seamlessly. However, his view of it is extremely dated. He last lived in it in the early 1940s, in the area around London. So, he is familiar with the city, to a certain extent. Any mistakes he makes will be through unfamiliarity with modern society. He will underestimate the government's ability to communicate and possibly track him. Again, they were giving her incredulous looks. She plowed on. His information, while old, is more than sufficient for him to adapt to the non-magical society quite quickly. We have searched for him in the magical community, and with magic, but so far there haven't been any signs of him. The closest heading we have on him is that he is likely in London. I fear he has snuck into your society to escape the country, or is lying low until he can do that. They had grim expressions, now. He views non-magicals as little better than beasts, and has no qualms about killing anyone who displeases him or gets in his way. He is very clever, very smart, extremely dangerous, and knows very deadly magics. Your police forces should be warned not to try to apprehend him, if they see him. They need to call in backup if they even suspect he might be nearby. I understand there will be many false alarms, but as dangerous as he is to non-magicals, it can't be helped. She picked up a box from beside her and slid it across the table. There are 1,000 emergency beacons disguised as cell phones in that box. Distribute them as widely as possible to responsible people. When a sighting of Tom comes in, pressing the button will connect them directly to the Ministry of Magic's police, and someone will teleport there immediately. She gave Walker a steady look. I know you have all the wizarding enclaves under surveillance. I would if I were you. Go over the recordings for today, starting at about 9:30 a.m. until 3 p.m. She again indicated the folders. There are several photos of Tom in there, both what he used to look like in 1945 and the boy he has taken. He will appear as one or the other. Do not be taken in by his appearance. He put down a full-grown wizard who suspected him, almost instantly, and caused great damage to Hogwarts. They were lucky no one died. If not for magic, dozens would have. She sighed. Unfortunately, he should know the disillusionment charm. So, even if you don't see him, he might still have passed through your recording. Look for anything that one of your technical specialists would call unusual doors opening for no reason, and so forth. She stopped for a moment. That's basically all I can tell you. He is a threat to everyone. She turned to Walker. I'm sure he suspects that staying in Britain is foolhardy. He would eventually make a mistake and be captured. So, I expect him to make a run for either the continent or elsewhere. She looked at them. The magical avenues for leaving the country, port keys, apparition, the FLA network, even the night bus are being closely monitored for signs of him. She frowned and shook her head. I think we've closed all the magical avenues. Which means his only way to escape has to be non-magical. She gave them a wry smile. Knowing the attitudes most magicals have for non-magicals, especially in his time, I'm sure he will conclude that escaping via the non-magical world will be a piece of cake. After all, in his day the magicals would never think to warn the non-magicals that a magical criminal might be trying to sneak out of the country. So, she looked at Walker and raised an eyebrow. If you could have agents watching the airports and ferries, we might catch him when he tries to leave. She paused and waited expectantly. I suspect that he will assume he doesn't need to hide from the magical police in the middle of a non-magical area, so, hopefully, he won't be trying to conceal himself with an illusion. Frowning heavily, the man nodded. He understood the gravity of the situation. Twilight looked over to McCall. If you could alert your foreign agents that a dangerous fugitive is out, and have them watch the arriving flights and ferries from Britain, we might catch him that way. He nodded impassively. I would offer some of my guards, but I think their unfamiliarity with both your society and magical that they would be more of a hindrance than a help, she said apologetically. Do you have any questions? So, which of these is what he looks like? Asked Walker's assistant, holding up a photo of Tom, when he was in Hogwarts, and Goyle. The one on your left is how Tom looked when he attended Hogwarts in 1945. The other is Vincent Goyle. Tom could look like either of the two in public. She could see he didn't understand. I told you he had split himself in half, which means, as explained in the folders, that he split his soul in half. The men exchanged wondering looks. He put it in an artifact that has been hidden since 1945. Because he did the split in early 1945, the soul piece in the artifact has been frozen in time, you might say. He has no memories beyond the moment he was split off. The only information he has on the modern world is what he has learned this year at Hogwarts. Based on the information we have, we believe he will look exactly as he did in 1945. He will look like a typical teenager. She stopped and took a breath. Albeit, one who will act annoyingly superior to anyone he meets. That's fortunate for us because it means most of his magical knowledge will be at Hogwarts level. She frowned. Maybe a bit above, as he appears to have been an exceptional student in 1945. The man slowly nodded. So, he said slowly, a teenager with a gun who isn't afraid to use it, at any time, on anyone? Maybe psychotic? She nodded back. Yes, I'm afraid so. We'll need to bring in as many special technology people as possible, he said to his superior. Walker sighed. I'll ring Sir John, bring him up to date, and get the necessary clearances. We can have soldiers, out of uniform, posted by morning. Perhaps call in Interpol with him as a person of interest. Do not approach. Twilight nodded. She knew that Sir John was Chief of the General Staff, the professional head of the British Army. What about funding? Will this riddle be able to pay for transport anywhere? Asked McCall. It seems highly unlikely that the boy would have easy access to pounds, given that he's been living in the magical world. Twilight shook her head. He's not stupid, and he's had over 7 months to prepare. I don't think we can assume he is destitute. Not with how quickly he has moved and managed to escape detection so far. She sighed. His parents claim not to have seen him since he went to Hogwarts in September, and they appear truthful. He might not have a lot of money, but I would be surprised if he didn't have enough to make it to France or the Netherlands. If he has enough for a plane ticket, he could go to almost any big city on the continent. Assuming he discovers how easy and far he can travel by plane, that is. She grimaced. When he was around, passenger airplanes were for the rich, and the magicals mostly ignored or belittled the concept. Many still do. Without access to the non-magical world, I doubt he has learned of all the changes your world has gone through in the last 50 years. That ignorance, however, won't last for long if he is in the non-magical world for any length of time. Walker sighed and slumped in his chair. He gave McCall a sympathetic look. Looks like neither of us are going home soon, he said dryly. Twilight grimaced. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but I thought you should know as soon as possible, given Minister Fudge's truculence on the matter. On that note, the meeting ended and the directors and their assistants hurried off to their offices. Only the Prime Minister expected to be home before dawn. After the meeting, Castor escorted the princess up to the official apparition/teleportation room at the top of the building. It was the only room in the building that was excluded from the protective anti-apparition/teleportation spells. It also had an armed squad in the next room and observing through a one-way view illusionary wall. They were armed with wands, pistols, and a machine gun. The Muggle weapons had bullets enhanced with magic. The pistols used stupefy and the machine gun used bombard us. Anyone arriving with hostile intent would go down. Depending on how hostile, they would go down hard, if necessary. Then he headed for Sir Walker's office. An awful lot of things needed to start happening, and happening quickly. His first call would be to the Brunton Air Base. They would need every advantage they could for this, so they needed to recall as many changelings back to base as possible. But he had to run it by the director, first. He nodded to James Wooten as he entered the main office. The man was already on the phone to Field Marshal Sir Chapel, he realized, arranging for the special technology people they would need. "I'm not sure how many agents you can free for this," Patrick was saying to Colin as he walked into the director's office and sat down. "I think," McCall said, "that the best I can do is get the Dunkirk, Calais, and Dieppe ferry ports, and the Paris, Amsterdam, Frankfurt, and Madrid international terminals covered by morning." He shook his head. "That's about it for special technology people in my division, and they'll be stretched really thin." "That'll do, I suppose, for the morning," said Patrick. Colin looked over at Castor. "Is this guy as deadly as she said?" Castor sighed. "Think of him as an IRA terrorist who's carrying a machine gun that shoots grenades instead of bullets and never runs out. Plus, he can perfectly disguise himself as anyone he wants. The psychological profile on him is that he's a highly functional sociopath with delusions of grandeur. He considers torturing people as fun. He would think nothing of crashing an airliner, sinking a ferry, or causing a building to collapse to create a diversion for him to escape. All of which he is capable of doing with a wand, which he has." He nodded at the folders they had out. "It's all in the folders, including accounts from surviving witnesses the last time he was active when there were any survivors." He took a deep breath and let it out. "I think we should deploy as many changelings as we can. Their ability to sense emotions may be the only way to detect him. From what I've been told by the wizards, and what the changelings have said about their ability, he should stand out like a red floodlight among candles." The other two frowned as they considered his words. "How many can we field?" Castor shrugged. "Out of the 315 we have, I think we could get nearly 280 if we paired the less skilled ones with special technology agents and told them they were on loan from Equestria to explain any mistakes they make in regards to interacting with others. From what I've been told, the others are what we would deem unsuitable for military service." He grimaced. "It's not that simple actually, it's just that they are so specialized that they can't do anything outside their hive duties." He shook his head. "She told me one tunneler could carve her way through a kilometer of solid rock in a day and leave a tunnel that could withstand an earthquake without damage. But if you told her to count her fingers and toes 3 times, she would end up with 3 answers. Expecting her to cope well in the non-changeling world would be unrealistic." Patrick sighed. "An idiot savant?" Castor nodded. "Apparently, their queen liked to tailor changelings into specialties so they wouldn't be unhappy with what they did. As long as they could do their job and were fed adequately, they were happy." McCall frowned and sighed. "A serf class that would always be happy with their lot, follow orders perfectly, and never revolt," he said flatly. Castor nodded in agreement. "Most didn't survive after the battle. They couldn't cope by themselves. The ones that did survive, did so by joining a group of other changelings and making themselves useful to them in exchange for food and protection. Still," Patrick said, "in this situation, I think we can certainly use their talents." He sighed. "We'll just have to pair the less experienced ones up with our people and selected members of the constabulary." James poked his head into the room. "They've started collecting the videos from the different locations. They expect to be through them all by midnight. Castor stood, I'll call Brunton and get them organized, then start calling in the special technology people in MI5. If you can get the list of airports and ferries to check, we can start on making port keys to get everyone to Brunton, assigned a partner, and then to their destination. With any luck, we can have every location under surveillance by 6 in the morning, tomorrow. Patrick looked at Colin. I don't want to send any of the changelings outside the UK, just yet. I don't think they've had enough training on the European countries, yet. They're still having a few problems with understanding British culture. Colin nodded his understanding as he, too, stood. I'll get started on my end, then. The two left as Patrick picked up his phone. Lights out had been some time ago. Harry had been staring at the underside of the canopy on his bed since then. The room wasn't completely dark, however. The full moon was less than a week away, and its light through the windows was more than enough to illuminate the room. He'd had to draw his curtains tightly closed to get it really dark. Or if he had wanted real privacy. The other boys, Ron, Dean, Seamus, and Neville were all asleep. Last year's complaints of Ron's snores not letting them sleep had been dealt with when Harry had complained to his mum. She had disappeared into the Ponyville library on the ground floor for hours, Spike said, before returning with a solution. It was called the Wife's Perfect Rest. It was a simple spell. It detected when someone started to snore, and prevented anyone from hearing it. All other sounds came through, both ways, without impedance. So, you could hear the snorer wake up, sneeze, cough, what have you, but not be kept up by a buzzsaw in your ear. Likewise, the snorer could hear everything around him, so they could wake to an alarm, Pee-Pee's crow, or the wife telling the lazy gob to get up. The book carefully did not mention that husbands could also use the spell on their wives if they were the ones snoring. It was a nice night, too. If he listened carefully, he could hear the occasional hoot or call from the Ollery or Forbidden Forest. Unfortunately, Harry couldn't seem to relax. He was as wide awake as if it were noon and he was in the Great Hall. That hadn't been the case earlier. The adrenaline rush of the disaster in the Great Hall had worn off well before lunch, leaving them all tired. However, the tense atmosphere of the interviews hadn't helped any of them rest in the afternoon. He'd especially had been worried the entire time the Aurors had been interviewing his herd and friends. Would they accidentally mention something that he wouldn't want out? He had been anxious even when Ginny had gone over for her interview. He wasn't sure why, just yet. It wasn't like he felt the same way about Hermione and Ginny as he did the Phillies, but they were his friends and he felt protective of them. They were all weary and sleepy by the time they finished the evening meal. He had been yawning in slightly muzzy hours before curfew, as had been most every pony. Many had even gone up early. But the moment his head hit the pillow, the events in the Great Hall had stampeded to the forefront of his mind. No matter how much he tried to shove them aside, into the little boxes that held all his memories, they kept crawling out. He had been barely conscious of putting up a shield when he saw Goyle lifting his arm. 1 second it wasn't there, and in the blink of an eye, it was. That was fine. They had practiced for many hours getting to the point where their shields came up every time, at full power, at a thought. However, he had been simply furious. Enraged that someone had attacked him and Hermione. Yes, the spell had been aimed in his direction, but it could easily have hit Hermione if she had moved in the wrong direction in the exchange of spells between Goyle and Gilderoy. Him being the target wasn't that much of a shock. He had always been the target, both in primary school and out. His home had to be included in that group, too. About the only place he wasn't a target was in Equestria or the Gryffindor common room. His cupboard, prior to that, had never been a place of security. It was where he was expected to be. Any safety it provided had been accidental. He had been allowed to stay because the adults couldn't legally toss him out. A lot like Tom Riddle. Harry had never really had a safe place until he had arrived in Ponyville. But, even then, Ponyville had its share of dangers. But they never singled him out. He had always been simply one of the herd. Anonymous. Just like the rest. He could handle being attacked. What wasn't so fine was his immediate longing to return that red spell that had splashed so on his shield with another, but with twice the power. A special shield breaker spell of his own, one that could easily shatter shields and throw the caster to the floor in severe pain. It wasn't the Crucio, but it was almost as effective at putting someone down. Once they were on the floor, then he could deal with them at his leisure. There had been several spells for him to choose from for that leisure, at the very edge of his conscience. He couldn't recall them now, but they hadn't been nice spells, he knew. Survival of the wizard or witch on the receiving end was questionable, at best. The pain before the end, though, would have been intense. How had he known those spells? He couldn't recall reading any books with such spells in them. The first in the group he thought of certainly hadn't sounded like a Latin-based curse. That meant it couldn't have come from any books in Hogwarts, or at least those that weren't based on European or Egyptian heritage. There might be books from other magical societies in the restricted section, but he had never noticed them. Was it odd that he now remembered a secret passage from the dungeons that led to the restricted section that MDM Pence guarded so jealously? He would have to see if it hadn't been closed. As careless as his mum was about leaving books for Spike to reshelve, he knew his mum would never have left out a book with such dangerous spells in it. Especially, when he might come across it before it was put back. The spell had sounded in his head like Des Adal. That rage it worried him. He didn't know where it came from. For sure he had never been that angry in Equestria. None of the monsters there had ever singled him out. If they went after him, it was because they felt he was invading their territory. Or, they had been driven out of their territory and were attacking him because he was in their sight and they were scared or hungry. All very reasonable reactions, all things considered. With the exception of timberwolves, most could be either escaped or driven off with a concerted effort by him and his friends. Only timberwolves went out of their way to hunt ponies. Oh, sure, he had a few run-ins with other ponies, but they had never gone after him with the intent to kill. Embarrass? Yes. Insult? Definitely. But never kill. Ponies didn't think that way. Once an enemy was down, they quit fighting. They would much rather have friends than enemies. If any pony died it was almost always by accident, not intent. He had no doubts that the spell Goyle had cast at him had been intended to cause great harm, if not outright kill him. But while he and Goyle had had their disputes, Goyle had never seemed to dislike him on a personal level. Everything had been at the instigation of Malfoy. The very few times they had met without Malfoy or Crabbe being around, last year, he had been cordial. Or, at least, as cordial as a muscle-bound thug could be when he had no orders. The longer Harry considered it, the more certain he was that it wasn't Goyle he had been enraged at, but something else. The spell, he had recognized it just from its color, was a cutting spell of a particularly nasty sort. It wouldn't be easy or quick to heal any cuts made by it, and the pain it caused would linger long after the wound itself healed. How did he recognize it? How did he know this? He didn't think like that. He didn't react like that. He was a good pony. Wasn't he? Goyle had been possessed. There wasn't any doubt of that in his mind. During the entire class, Goyle hadn't moved like Goyle did. He had been smoother, more graceful, lighter on his feet. Things no one had ever accused Goyle of being. So yeah. Possessed. Those books that Sunset had brought over had gone into great detail on Horcruxes. The books had mentioned how the one in the diary, in Book 2, had been designed to take over another person. Could it have been given to Goyle, this time? The books had made it quite clear that Malfoy Sr. had never known what the diary really was, only that giving it to someone in Hogwarts would cause a calamity and greatly harm Dumbledore in some manner. Harry had focused mainly on the first years. Even after Ellie's warning, it hadn't sunk in except to make him work harder on their spells. That Goyle might have been the Horcrux hadn't really registered. So. The last Horcrux, the diary, had taken over Goyle. He should have realized it. He should have told his mom. Ellie had warned them to watch him. This was his fault for not telling his mum. That was why Ellie had had a feeling of familiarity about the situation, the feeling of possession. Somehow, she had unconsciously picked up on Goyle's changes, just as she had noticed the head boy's misactions last year. Or, perhaps, had her magic somehow reacted to the possession? Had her magic, somehow, detected the same magic in Goyle that had been in Quirrell? Had it given her subconscious clues that not all was right with the boy? That Tom Riddle was again about to make an appearance? That would explain much, actually. Her magic had picked up the subtle clues of possession and compulsion in the other's magic, and brought it to her attention as a feeling that something was wrong. The clues fit. The next time she said something, he would listen closely. Tom Riddle, a young Voldemort wannabe, was loose in the world. And he had a grudge against Harry. Which meant he would be after Harry's herd, too. Ellie might notice before he did that something was coming. He should have realized it. But nothing in the books had been happening all year. There were no mysterious attacks. The basilisk was long gone. There weren't any other attacks, either. Plus, none of the awful events, tension, and terror that the second book had mentioned had happened this year except Dobby, of course. And that was because the crazy elf thought he was helping Harry. If not for Ellie's warning, he would never have suspected anything was wrong until it went wrong. And, despite that warning, he had still been surprised at Tom's competence and planning. In the books, Ginny had been acting well, not suspicious, but unlike herself. Goyle, on the other hoof, hadn't overtly changed at all this year. Or, at least, any changes had been so slight that they were things no one but his closest friends would have noticed. But, based on what the healer said, Tom had been confounding and obliviating his closest friends. They probably never remembered noticing anything different about the boy, in either word or deed. Plus, even if Harry had suspected Goyle had had the diary, who here would have believed him? Harry would be accused of overreacting, as he had last year with the centaurs. The professors just couldn't start casting detection spells. The parents would have been involved. And who knew if the wizard hiding in the diary couldn't have bluffed his way out of it? Or even, forewarned, managed to conceal himself and the diary? If Tom had realized the professors were suspicious of Goyle, he could have cast that Fidelius spell on the diary and himself. With that, it wouldn't have mattered if the spells detected him, the casters and witnesses wouldn't see that he was possessing Goyle. The perfect camouflage. As he had heard, hindsight had 20/20 vision. The only saving grace, as far as Harry was concerned, was that this version of Tom had only a Hogwarts education. He hadn't spent nearly 40 years combing the world for dark magics to wield and slowly building up a following of purebloods. Well, then, Harry resolved, the only solution was to match his magical growth to Tom's. At this point in time, Tom was a 6th year, only 4 years ahead of him. If he applied himself, he would finish 3rd year, easy, by the start of summer vacation. If he started the 4th year books this summer instead of waiting for school, he would be able to finish 5th year by next Christmas. Then he could start 6th year. By the time he started his 4th year at Hogwarts, he would have caught up with Tom, maybe passed him. He wondered if Tom would have as easy access to magical books as Harry had here. Plus, Tom would be traveling, not studying, not to mention having to secure some way to live. Nor trying to evade notice in the wizarding world. In 3 years, Harry calculated, he would be well ahead of Tom on magic. With the filly's help, and access to his mother's library, he was confident he would leapfrog ahead of the other boy. The fillies wouldn't like that, nor would his mum, he was sure. But the alternative would be to leave them at the non-existent mercies of a psychopath with no concept of mercy. One who, they had just seen, would strike without warning. It would be a difficult sell, but when he presented his final conclusions, his mum would have no choice but to teach him dark magic. He shuddered. Dark magic wasn't nice. It felt dirty and, well, distasteful. Harry vividly remembered the feel of the magic Voldemort had used to hurt him. Actually, now that he thought about it, it reminded Harry of Tyrek. He shuddered again. Now there was a centaur he had no interest in ever seeing again. He remembered the helpless feeling he had had as his magic was weight. Now that he thought about it, what had happened? He had felt a drain on his magic, but his magic wasn't the same as the ponies, they all knew that. His mum had even scanned his magic before they had found the portal. His magic had always been slightly different. Apparently, though, alike enough to be susceptible to losing some to attack by Tyrek. So, why did that remind him of dark magic? Tyrek hadn't actually used dark magic. King Sombra had used dark magic, and he had been dealt with well before Harry had arrived in Equestria. It suddenly felt as if Harry had ice water running through his veins. He had trouble breathing, and broke into a cold sweat. Yeah, now he remembered. When Tyrek had tried to take his magic, something else had fought back. It had been a dark and unsavory, but he had been relieved, at the time, that something was fighting to let him keep his magic. Together, they had fought. A black mist had temporarily surrounded him before disappearing as Tyrek moved on. Tyrek apparently hadn't noticed his resistance, or thought it was the same futile resistance other ponies had shown. He had taken the fall-off in magic from Harry as being the colt running out of magic instead of him successfully resisting and keeping a bit. The dark and creepy feeling had persisted for a few minutes after the monster had left, before slowly dissipating. He had felt quite sick and weak. But later, he had felt as if a dark fog in his head had disappeared. A fog he had never realized was there. Everything was sharper, clearer. That had been Tom's Horcrux. In his scar. He started shivering. His mum had never mentioned anything being different about his scar, either before or after the Tyrek incident. Despite the scar becoming less prominent. He had been in a bit of a panic when Sunset had first produced the books from her world. However, his mum had reassured him there wasn't a single trace of the evil wizard in his scar, at all. Her scans on his magic would have revealed any different magic in his scar, she had said. Just to alleviate his worries, she had redone several of her scans. The results had shown that there weren't any signs of either magic in his scar or a separate piece of soul in his head. There was only Harry's magic, Harry's soul. The only one in his head was Harry. Of course not, he now realized. Tyrek had greatly weakened both their magics. Without the magic to reinforce it, Voldemort's piece of soul had been too weak to do anything. According to his mum, that soul piece in his head would have been only about 1.5% the size of his. If he had had a piece of it in his head. Far too small, she had reassured him, to ever pose a threat to his soul. Even with magic, it would have been too small to affect him. If it had ever been in his scar to begin with, she had said. But, then, she had never previously scanned him for a piece of someone else's soul. You can't find something if you never think to look for it in the first place. Just as they had never thought to look for the diary before Sunset had shown them the books. There had certainly been a bit of strange magic in Harry's scar when he first came to Equestria, his mum had said last December, but there were no traces of it now. What had happened when Tyrek had attacked him? What had happened to the soul piece? Based on what he remembered of Quirrellmort's death, the soul piece emerging from the wizard had been like a black cloud that had formed a face. Harry had had a black mist around him, when Tyrek attacked. He didn't remember seeing a face, at that time. But he hadn't exactly been very alert, either. The pain had been rather overwhelming as if something were being ripped from his head. He had assumed that it was his magic being pulled away. However, now, from the books, he knew he had had not only part of Tom's magical abilities speaking to snakes but also a part of Tom's soul. He wondered if Tyrek had inadvertently pulled away the magic holding that soul piece at bay. His stomach felt like it had fallen to his toes. Instead of Voldemort's soul piece absorbing him, as the diary Tom had been absorbing Ginny in the books, Harry had absorbed Tom. And his memories. How much of him was Harry? How much was Tom? Harry and Voldemort were now one person. That would explain those odd memories he had from time to time. They weren't his, but Voldemort's. He couldn't stop shivering. He had read that a person was the sum of their memories, of their experiences. If a person had been burnt by a fire, and now feared fire, you could change the person by removing their memory of being burned. Then they wouldn't fear fire anymore. Conversely, if you put the memory of being burned into a person, a fake memory, they would then fear fire, and react accordingly when they saw it. What did it mean when Tom had had 17 years of memories and he had had only 10 when they merged? Or had it been that only some of Voldemort's memories persisted? The Dursleys had been right. He was a disgusting freak. Unknowingly, they had been trying to beat Voldemort out of him. Too bad they had failed. What would his mum say? He had to keep this a secret. If the witches and wizards found out, they would fear and hate him. They would say he was Voldemort. He would lose everything. Hermione and Ginny would disappear so fast, it would be like teleporting. The Fillies might try to stay, but they, too, would eventually leave. He wasn't really Harry. He would be alone. Again. And this time, it would be for a good reason. He would have to be especially vigilant about not thinking bad thoughts. Maybe he could remove all of Tom's memories that weren't spell-related. Instead of putting them in a pensieve, he could discard them. If they weren't there, they couldn't influence him. Right? He had to protect his herd. Leaving wasn't an option, Tom would just go after them in the hope to hurt him. As the tears ran down his face, he had a bitter smile. With some diligent digging into what memories he had, he would soon undoubtedly be far ahead of Tom in the magic department. He clenched his fists. When they next met, he would crush that insect for what he had done. He would have to start setting aside time every night to thoroughly go over his memories in every detail. His Occlumen's skills that he had learned so far would have to become much, much better. He had to carefully and cautiously examine each and every one to separate his memories from Tom's. That would be the only way to isolate the sources of those bad inclinations he had from time to time. It would take years, no doubt, but he would be a good pony. They were lucky. They had managed to comb through the videos for all the locations by midnight, as promised, using several dozen playback units, borrowed, from the BBC. One recording from outside of the leaky cauldron had been the critical one. The agent reviewing it had noticed a wizard exiting the pub in the late mid-morning, and stopping almost immediately to rearrange his appearance. That had seemed odd, but only a little. However, before the man had walked out of view, he had hailed and climbed into a taxi. That had made the agent take a closer look. A wizard who was unfamiliar with modern clothing styles, but was familiar enough to call a taxi. And, presumably, pay with modern pounds? What was wrong with that picture? Given the time stamp on the videotape, they built up a rough timeline. The time of the incident at Hogwarts and the wizard's exit from the pub left just enough time for an organized person to make the trip with a few brief stops on the way. He could have used one of the secret passages from Hogwarts to Hogsmeade and Operaat to a location with a private flue. From there, he could have gone to Diagon Alley, visited Gringotts, removed money in both galleons and quid, and left via the pub. Goyle would have had a terrible time accomplishing all those things, given his age, especially the apparition. Therefore, it couldn't have been Goyle. It had to be this Tom character that they had been warned about. It was easily believable, based on the personality of the person Twilight had described. Which made Tom/Goyle very dangerous, indeed. It took a few more hours to get a Crown Judge's production order, track down the taxi company, and get an answer as to where that taxi had taken its passenger. They weren't positive this wizard was Tom, but they didn't dare risk treating it as a standard investigation. Thus, Castor and his team were forced to waste time canvassing Bexley High Street in both directions, and the side streets. Unfortunately, it was very early in the morning, the sun hadn't even risen when they arrived. Which meant Tom/Goyle could be in any of the houses, rooming houses, or hotels in the vicinity if he hadn't operated elsewhere. There certainly weren't any known wizarding residences or businesses in the area, so he really was going off the radar as far as the wizards were concerned. The Sunday Daily Prophet was usually just a recap of the previous week's events. Most of the articles were run verbatim, with small additions to flesh them out or provide a bit more information that hadn't been available in the original. Not this Sunday's, though. Above the fold, one half said, "Dumbledore flails again," and the other said, "Lockhart the Blackheart," and was quite pleased with the news parchment. It also went into the details that hadn't been available before Saturday's special edition hit the owls. The real blockbuster was the discovery that Gilderoy Lockhart, the darling adventurer and heartthrob of many a witch, was a charlatan, a scoundrel, a fake. Jameson had sent a reporter to Wagga Wagga in New South Wales, Australia. As the location for one of the adventurer's books, it was early morning there, and not the afternoon or quickly approaching night as it was in most of the rest of the places of his adventures. The reporter had had a full day to do his research, and what profitable research it had been. It turned out, after a few short background interviews, that the description of the town's savior, as told by several witnesses, didn't match Gilderoy not at all. In fact, quite a number in Wizarding Enclave of several hundred didn't remember seeing him until well after the incident itself. Diligent investigation had quickly unraveled the story as more and more details failed to match the book. Some town's wizards, important to the published account in Lockhart's book, remembered Lockhart as their savior. Others remembered him as being an Armenian warlock who was in town at that time. The primary witness, however, did insist it was Lockhart. A visit to a healer had quickly determined that he had been obliviated. The healer placed it as happening sometime after the time the werewolf was a problem, but suspiciously close to when Gilderoy had arrived on the scene, according to other wizards and witches. The Daily Prophet was paying the healer to see if she could reverse any of the obliviated memories. Even one reversed memory that contradicted the book would be sufficient to prove the fraud. That one group of interviewees remembered the flamboyant Gilderoy being in town for a week about a month or so after the incident, while the others only remembered seeing him during the incident, was pretty damning evidence. If he was only in town once, which both groups agreed was the case, then how could they remember the wizard as being at different times? One person might make a mistake, but dozens? Not bloody likely. The Daily Prophet editors were convinced that the book was a fraud, the story stolen from the true savior of the town. Jameson had a second reporter attempting to track the Armenian. Several reporters were checking out the witnesses in the other locations mentioned in his books. Preliminary reports from them also found discrepancies. There would be follow-up stories for weeks. His fame would push their revenues higher, and spread the reach of the news parchment to overseas markets. Maybe, she should wonder out loud if an international section might be interesting within earshot of one of the reporters returning from the continent, of course. Then act supportive when Jameson mentioned it. The second headline went after Dumbledore, portraying him as a great wizard getting on in his age and slowly failing in his pursuits. As the leading figure in the English wizarding community, he should have detected Lockhart's fraudulent claims before hiring him for Hogwarts. Didn't he do any research on his professors before hiring them? Even a cursory examination of Gilderoy Lockhart's exploits would have revealed something wasn't right. Just his demand that all of his books be purchased should have set off alarms. Not to mention that there were precious few spells in the books for the students to learn. Plus, 2 of the books took place at the same time. Using apparition between the 2 locations would have been impossible for even the most powerful of wizards. Or required a ridiculously large number of expensive international port keys which neither book mentioned him doing. Then the editors roasted the old wizard for his failure to detect the vampire months before now. Not to mention protect Gregory Goyle from the vampire's evil schemes and depredations. Plus, were there other vampires near Hogwarts? Everyone knew vampires moved in covens. Were their children really safe at Hogwarts? There were more than a few outraged quotes from the pure BLD families, both liberal and conservative, over the fact that it was a pure BLD scion who had been abducted. What was Dumbledore doing to find the missing teenager? He was the greatest wizard in the country. What was he doing, in his position as chief warlock of the Wizengamot, to find the boy? How many other students at Hogwarts had been victims of the vampire, and no one knew it? Had he done anything since the attack to search for such victims? Did he even care? Another article brought up his past mistakes, such as never bothering to check on an associate in Azkaban, nor catching the real culprit even though he had been in Hogwarts for 4 years. The recent updating of the protective spells around the castle simply proved their point. He had been in charge for decades, and not once had he tried to get the spells updated. It had taken the pressure of the new equestrians to get that job done. How was it possible that foreigners were more competent than the great Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore? Despite that, the new spells still hadn't detected the vampire. The ministry needed to go over the spells protecting the castle, immediately, to prevent this from happening again. After dragging the wizard's name through as much mud as they could, they then went into detail about how he had let himself be distracted at the ministry for 2 hours, yesterday, arguing politics while there was a major disaster happening at the school he was supposed to be protecting. People said Hogwarts was the safest place in England because Dumbledore was there. By allowing himself to be distracted by the politics at the ministry, he was not safeguarding their children as was his job. He needed to make a choice. Either focus on the children, or focus on his political aspirations. Inside the news parchment were many more details about the events of yesterday, going into far more detail now that the healers and aurors weren't scrambling to save patients and solve problems. This time, the list of injured, their treatments, and final conditions was far more complete. The minister even came in for some criticism for delaying Dumbledore's return to Hogwarts after Dumbledore had been messaged by his deputy headmistress, Professor McGonagall. All in all, a satisfactory takedown on the old guard leader in British wizarding society. Whatever he did next, would be closely watched and questioned. Her offhand comment that a regular column on the wizard's actions might be interesting had Jameson chortling for joy, and ordering one of the string reporters to do just that. If they couldn't find anything recent, well, then, they would just have to start examining his past decisions, wouldn't they? Altogether, it was a satisfying piece of work. Just as gratifying had been her visits to various personages in the wizarding community. MDM Longbottom, the McDougalls, and the Tepins had been especially grateful of her dropping by and telling them of the danger their children had been in. That their children had weathered the incident with scraps and cuts and no permanent injuries had been a great relief. She left them wondering if Dumbledore would bother with telling them anything before the story was printed by the Daily Prophet. He hadn't. Anything she might suggest in the future, she knew, would be looked on favorably by them. A few minor conversations over lunch or at a dinner party would have them pushing ideas she had led them to, as if they had thought of them all by themselves. Then she had visited a few of the more conservative families, those considered somewhat neutral, like the Bulstrodes and the Corners. Hearing how their children had been attacked by Draco Malfoy and Vincent Crabbe had not been a pleasant conversation for them. That their children already had been treated and returned to the school was gratifying to them. Especially as they knew from personal experience when they were in Hogwarts that parents were rarely advised of many of the incidents in Hogwarts. Dumbledore certainly didn't talk to them about this incident. They, too, would listen to her political hints in the future. Coached, of course, as mild comments on things that had Sirius Black's interest, or one of his other supporters. Always, as if the subjects at hand were vague gossip she had heard. Just as she passed on her observations, and the comments of the editors at the Daily Prophet, as if she were merely passing on interesting tidbits of gossip. That they assumed she had met with those reporters and editors over lunch, or accidentally in Diagon Alley, instead of being in their offices as they discussed the stories, she never corrected. Dumbledore was being sidelined on the political front. He was putting the blame on the conservative families, his old foes, not realizing there was a new player on the field. That her goals and his coincided, for the moment, helped mask the disquiet and disloyalty she was fermenting among his allies. He had no idea that he was slowly losing all his pawns and followers, incorrectly assuming they were following his lead, when it was her to whom they ultimately were listening. Hopefully, he wouldn't realize it until it was way too late for him to regain them. This latest fiasco wouldn't be enough to make him relinquish any of his present seats of power, not yet. His position in the ministry, however, was weaker than it had been a week ago. By next Christmas, she hoped to have forced him out of his position as Supreme Mugwump of the International Council of Wizards. Plus, in all that, she hadn't had to cast a single spell, yesterday, on a single wizard or witch. It was almost refreshing, in its own way. Tom used a small bit of magic to wake him at sunrise. It was so small that he had doubts that the so-called trace would even have reacted, if he still had to worry about that. That he didn't need his wand to cast it was a factor, too. If anything, it would have been counted as very minor accidental magic. However, the trace only worked on children under the age of wizarding majority, 17. Because the cutoff for Hogwarts was being born before September 1st, and his birthday was in December, he had started Hogwarts at almost 12. Meaning he had been 17 when his diary self had been created. Goyle had been under majority, but Tom wasn't. Tom had absorbed him and used his magic, with the diaries, to create a new body with his magic. Which meant that the trace on Goyle's magic would consider him to be 68 years old. So, no trace to worry about. Be that as it may, however, Tom was up, dressed, and finished with his morning routine in only a few minutes. He stepped outside the room, closed and locked the door, and then cast a Muggleversion charm. Anyone thinking of going into this room would suddenly realize they needed to do something else more important, somewhere other than here. He headed down to the check-in desk. The morning Muggle clerk had just arrived, fortunately. It was simple for him to walk over and lightly touch the Muggle's arm. He cast the confusion charm and a compulsion charm through his touch. You remember me coming down at 8, asking for a breakfast recommendation, and leaving. I returned an hour later. I said I had work to do, and I didn't want to be disturbed. I did the same for lunch and dinner. You will remember that happening every day that you work. You will only vaguely remember the different restaurants open at 8 that you recommended. He stepped back from the blank-faced Muggle. Excuse me, sir, he said loudly. The Muggle blinked and shook his head uncertainly. Excuse me, sir, Tom repeated. The Muggle jerked and turned to him. Oh. I'm sorry, he said with a conciliatory tone, what can I do for you? Could you suggest a nearby pub where I could get a decent breakfast? Ah, the Muggle blinked again, at this hour. I think the only thing open this early is the Chislehurst. That would be out the door, turn right, and about 10 minutes up the street. You shouldn't have any troubles finding it, it's beside the Chislehurst Clinic. The meals are reasonably priced, if a bit plain. Tom nodded and murmured, thank you. He headed out the door, and turned right. Once he was well out of sight, he ducked into an alley and apparat to another alley that he had noticed yesterday from the taxi that was near a street much further away, and closer to the heart of London. After casting a new illusion, he looked to be a man of 30 in an expensive suit. Just in case someone was trying to track him. It took a few minutes, but he finally waved a taxi down. Gatwick Airport, please. He hopped inside. The driver started moving the taxi. Which terminal? U.K., France, Germany. His voice trailed off. Thinking quickly, Tom said, Berlin. The driver nodded. The airport was stunning. It was all he could do not to stare as the cab approached. The size of the planes was beyond his imagination. They made the planes he had seen in 1944 look tiny. It was like seeing a train fly. And their speed. Nothing, absolutely nothing the wizards had could compare with the speed these planes had as they took to the sky. They easily climbed higher and faster than any wizard could hope to fly a broom in only a matter of minutes. Not even the planes he had seen in 1944 could compare. Of course, watching yesterday's replay of the launch of the Buran spaceplane as it left for Mars for Merlin's sake had left him thoroughly shaken. The Muggles had 2 bases on the moon and were now halfway to Mars to set up that base. The announcer had even talked about plans for the first flight to the next star. The wizards had never considered, seriously, going to the moon. And Mars? Never even crossed their minds. They were quite happy with the tiny world they knew. All because of the special technology brought through the portal by the Atlanteans. No equestrians. The equestrians had managed to do what no wizard or witch had ever imagined, convinced the Muggles that magic was technology, and nothing to be alarmed or afraid of. As one news reporter he had heard put it, any technology sufficiently advanced from one's own is indistinguishable from magic, but it isn't magic, it's technology. He knew it was magic, though, after watching the equestrians in Hogwarts in Goyle's Memories, and watching them, himself, this year. These equestrians were much smarter than he had given them. Clearly smarter than the Muggles, at the very least. Which was why he was going to Gatwick. Heathrow was still recovering from yesterday, he imagined, with rescheduled and postponed flights. The general confusion that would extend to Gatwick should help him to slip out of the country. It took all of his control to bring up his occlumency barriers so he didn't look like a child from a country village staring at the big city. He calmly thanked the driver, paid, and started inside the terminal. He took a long look around, trying to project the air of someone merely scanning their surroundings. He was quite happy with his progress in occluding. It had progressed to the point where if he hadn't known he was occluding, he would have thought he was a regular businessman in a new location, getting his bearings. All his emotions, except a mild curiosity, were firmly locked away. Undoubtedly, he didn't need to do this. The wizards were probably still looking for him in Hogwarts. That he might have fled would probably come to them later today. Then they'd start with the standard wizarding locations, first. That Goyle, or even a vampire, could maneuver in the Muggle world would leave them slack-jawed in disbelief. Back in 1944 he wouldn't have worried about wandering in the Muggle world. His magic was more than up to the task of dealing with problems. But the programs he had watched yesterday seemed to indicate that these Muggles were much more aware of their surroundings. The Bobbies had radios, now, and they could call for help too easily for his comfort. He didn't want to attract the attention of the Muggles. Too much of a disturbance would attract the Obliviators. In the cleanup, they might realize he had been the cause, giving a clue that his cover story of a vampire was a lie. So, he would act as if he were under constant observation. The building was bloody huge. The entirety of Diagon Alley would easily fit in the concourse area. There were shops and offices looking out onto the floor, too. It was easy to ignore his distaste for the Muggles in admiring their building. Hanging from the ceiling were a series of display boards with headings of departures above them, in several different languages. It was confusing to a newcomer, to say the least. He didn't know which way to turn, or where to go. There was nothing for it, he'd have to ask. Looking around, he noticed a Bobby not far away. He headed over. "Excuse me, officer," he said, approaching the man. "I usually use Heathrow, but with all the excitement, yesterday, I was worried about getting a proper flight. However," he paused and looked around, "I'm a bit lost, here. Can you tell me where to go for the next flight to Marseille?" He smiled at the Muggle, using his occlumency to help him appear harmless and innocent. A woman seated in the row of chairs at the street windows facing into the lobby, was staring at him curiously. He glanced at her and nodded congenially. She looked away, as if embarrassed at being caught. He would have sneered if he hadn't locked his emotions away. "Marseille, you say?" The man looked up at the big boards hanging from the ceiling and shifted a few steps to get a closer look. "The flights are in alphabetical order by destination," he said, staring intently. "Looks like you're a bit early, the next flight for Marseille isn't until almost noon. And you've a bit of a hike, too. You want the British Airways counter at the far end of the building." He pointed. "The cabbie must have dropped you off over here by mistake." Tom shrugged. "That's all right. It gives me time to review my speech." He looked off down the terminal. "A little exercise won't hurt, either." "Glad I could help, sir." Tom murmured, "Thank you," and set off. The woman was staring at him as he walked off. He pretended not to notice. A bit of irritation at being stared at leaked through his shields. Castor and Debbie were on Bexley High Street, some distance from the post office, now. 4 other specialists were across the street, 2 lings and 2 government wizards. 2 other pairs were keeping watch on the back alleys on both sides. 6 pairs had headed in the opposite direction when they first had arrived at the taxi's drop-off location. The changelings had each been paired with a special technology officer, and appeared to everyone as normal PC bobbies making inquiries. The photo from the camera at the leaky cauldron had been grainy, but the picture was clear enough to show the people they met. The changelings had been carefully monitoring every house they passed for any signs of troubled, anxious, or scared people, with no success. The businesses were vacant, and the people in the flats were sleeping that early in the day. Now that it was getting into the workday, things had picked up in the flats, and some people were already heading for their offices. Castor walked in the front door of the hotel and looked around the small check-in area. This hotel was clearly a repurposed flat house from the last century. The clerk behind the desk looked up, and straightened quickly on seeing their uniforms. Castor didn't need Debbie to signal him that the man was slightly alarmed at their entry. Castor smiled broadly and walked over. "Top of the morning to you, Governor," he said jovially. "I wonder if you could help us." Debbie quietly held out the photos they had, including ones of Goyle and Tom. "These 3, Castor continued, might be witnesses to a crime. We are trying to locate them to ask a few questions. Have you seen any of them?" He paused, then added, "They would have checked in yesterday at about noon." The man took the photos and studied them carefully, frowning. Then his expression cleared. "Why, yes," he said, "I think I do." He looked up smiling, singling out the photo of Goyle. "He's in room 24, I believe." He glanced over down at the guest book on the desk. He flipped it open and ran a finger down the page. "Yes," he said, looking back up. "He's in room 24, and he's booked it for a week." He looked over at the staircase and frowned, then looked at the clock on the wall opposite the desk, behind Castor. "You could go right up, but since it's 7:15, I believe he'll be down shortly. He told me yesterday that he expects to take breakfast before 8, at the Chislehurst, in the Chislehurst Clinic building, up slightly beyond the post office. Just like he did yesterday. I recommended it to him when he asked." The clerk returned his attention to Castor. "He spent all day yesterday in his room. He said he has some work to do and expects to spend most of his time in the room." Castor gave a sidelong glance at Debbie. She just maintained an even expression of polite interest, but she did touch her belt with one hand. That was the signal that the man wasn't stressed or upset. He was probably telling the truth as he knew it. Castor hadn't missed that slip about the man taking breakfast at the clinic as he had yesterday when he hadn't arrived until lunchtime. Tom was definitely here. Castor nodded genially, and glanced back at the staircase. "No need to disturb him, just yet. We'll wait outside. Thank you for your help." He turned and led PC Debbie back out the front door. He signaled across the street as they exited. One of the 2 pairs crossed to meet them to one side of the hotel. The second pair moved down the street so that they could watch the hotel without being obvious about it. "I think we found him," Castor said. "Call the others here. You watch the front counter for our man to appear. He's apparently upstairs at the moment." The front windows gave a clear view of the front room and the bottom of the staircase. He looked at the other changeling, Ally. "You keep alert for any signs of panic, anger, anything out of the ordinary." She nodded and fixed her unblinking gaze on the second floor. Debbie softly sighed. Ally blinked, then pretended to examine the brickwork along the roof's edge. He turned back to the other agent. "Make sure we have several teams covering the back, and the others, the front. We don't want this to go tips up." Castor led Debbie down the street to an alley, where he pressed the panic button Twilight had supplied. The response was gratifyingly quick. A team of 6 Aurors popped in beside them. The one taking the lead was a large, bronze-skinned man with bronze hair and an exaggerated widow's peak. He glanced at Castor, who was holding up the panic button box in one hand. "I'm Auror Savage," he said, nodding to Castor. Castor introduced himself as a chief inspector and Debbie as his PC for the day. There was a brief series of introductions for the rest of the Aurors, then Castor told them what they had so far. He did not tell them about the special technology pistols the other constables carried, nor the one he had been cleared to carry. If things went well, they would never be used. If things did go tips up, they would find out if bullets carrying blasting curses could punch through the shield that this wizard would undoubtedly be using. He doubted the wizard would be expecting magic-enhanced bullets, and would put up a shield to stop ordinary ones. It might be their only trump card. "There haven't been any signs of a vampire here," Castor said, maintain the fiction that the boy was being remotely controlled. "But the one we think is his Renfield was identified by the clerk in the hotel just down this way," he pointed. "We have agents covering the back," he gestured, "as well at each end of the street." Savage nodded. "That's good," the wizard said. "We'll take it from here. Your people can be our backup in case he manages to slip away from us." Castor stepped in front of the man when he started to move. "No," Castor said coldly. The Auror stopped and raised an eyebrow. "If he sees any of you, he'll either flee or start fighting. So, first, we'll evacuate the civilians from the ground floor so he won't be able to take any hostages," Castor said flatly. "We'll use the excuse that the IRA has a bomb nearby. Then we'll do the buildings to either side. You can seal off the second floor while we pull everyone from the first. If we can, we'll get everyone from the second floor, too. Then you can move in." They stared at each other a moment, the Savage sighed. "My orders are to work with you, so we'll do this your way." He shook his head, clearly disagreeing with what he had to do. Castor nodded, and pulled out his radio. He clicked it twice, then said, "Team 5, evacuate the building on the east of the hotel, Team 7, the building on the west. Use the excuse of an IRA bomb in the hotel. Teams 1 and 3 will take the hotel. Teams 2 and 4, send the civilians east on the street." After getting the acknowledgements, he turned to Savage. "PC Debbie, here, will signal you to come into the hotel when we've cleared the ground floor." Savage nodded, frowning slightly, and clearly unhappy at not being in charge. But at least he was willing to follow his orders from the ministry. Things went surprisingly smoothly. Castor re-entered the hotel and corralled the desk clerk. "We suspect there is an IRA bomb in the hotel, please go outside and follow directions." The man gaped at him, and then looked past the 4 out the door to see the waiting officer and his PC ally. The man looked back at Castor, then hurried out. It took only a few minutes for the Castor, Debbie, and Team 3 to clear everyone out of the ground floor, not speaking in anything over a whisper. Castor kept a close watch on Debbie, who was on alert for any changes from the rooms above to indicate alarm, or even curiosity. When Team 2 started clearing the first floor, Debbie signaled the Aurors. They quietly took positions on the staircase. Once the first floor was finished, Castor went to Savage. "Now put up your anti-port key and anti-apparition spells." Castor and Debbie went to the far end of the floor and started knocking on doors. One of the wizards went with the 2 and surreptitiously cast a silencing spell on the civilians' shoes as they came out of the rooms. Team 3 handled hustling the civilians by room 24 and started them down the stairs. Just as soon as the last person disappeared completely down the stairs, Savage cast a silencing charm and blasted the door open, his teammate following that up with stunning jinxes as fast as possible. Goyle's lifeless and cold body told them that their quarry had probably fled long before Castor's people had even arrived on Bexley High Street. The condition and placement of the body convinced the Aurors that they really were dealing with a rogue vampire. Castor was quick to send the alert that they had found signs of their quarry, and that he might be attempting to flee the country, if he hadn't already done so. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 62. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author tkepner on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.